Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, welcome back to my channel. My name is Shikra. So in this video we're going to be talking about vintage, luxury vintage. Luxury vintage has been on the rise, I think, for about 3 years now. All of a sudden vintage is kind of in, it's kind of trendy, and it's like, hey, if you can get a vintage piece, you got it. Okay, so I want to start off first with kind of going over kind of maybe the stigma and the criticism that has kind of been associated with vintage, luxury vintage. I'm kind of going more towards luxury vintage here in this video in the past. So because vintage has always been around, it's kind of been more of a niche thing, you know. Luxury vintage, for the most part, everyone wants to get things brand new and when they first came out and directly from the brand store or whatever, rather than going vintage, because vintage can also be, known as secondhand or previously used and all that stuff. And I feel like in the past there was kind of a criticism and a side eye given to people who were using and wearing these, vintage items, because they're like, oh, so you can't afford the original or the item brand new. So I do feel like that is something that vintage pieces have had to kind of always had to bear and overcome in a sense. And I think that criticism is fair? I actually don't. I feel like vintage pieces have been loved. I think that's the best way to look at it. They've been loved, but they want to find a new home because they're still valuable and they're still usable, so there's no point in throwing things away. Okay, so with that being said, of course that means luxury vintage was kind of like I said, niche, and not too many people were interested or really wore luxury vintage items. So let's jump into this. Celebrities. I feel like lately celebrities have been indulging and wearing a whole lot more vintage luxury items, and this has helped brighten and widen the whole sphere of vintage luxury, because now we're seeing it a whole lot more on celebrities wearing them day to day or wearing them on the red carpet. I recently watched on I think Vogue Italy, Italian Vogue, their YouTube channel. They had Kendall Jenner do her 7 days, what she wears, and a lot of her items were vintage items. A lot were I think vintage Gucci items that she wore, and she was wearing them day to day. So this is another way to kind of show celebrities wearing vintage luxury items day to day. And I do feel like as we've seen more red carpet looks like this has kind of given people a little bit more confidence to rock vintage items and not feel as if maybe they're a little bit less than, which I feel like might be a really strong opinion for me to kind of put out there. But I do feel like celebrities and even influencers too, I guess you could add them to this category, they have been indulging in a whole lot more vintage items. You see them saying, oh, this is vintage, or I got this from the Real, or everywhere that vintage is available now for luxury items, people are actually looking rather than just skipping that category when they're going through things. So I do feel like that definitely helps set the stage once we started seeing a whole lot more celebrities and influencers and people who are a little bit well known saying and wearing vintage items. And it's like a catch-22 here, I feel, with this statement I'm making, because it kind of just shows the herd mentality and people just constantly looking up to these people for kind of everything they do in a sense. And I don't want that to be viewed in a wrong way. If you do look up to celebrities or influencers for trends and ideas of what to buy and what to wear, I think a lot of times people try to make that be a negative thing, and I think it has its pros and its cons. So I think there's nothing wrong with that, but then at the same time, make sure you're just following your sense of style and wearing and buying whatever you like. So sorry for that tangent. Okay, so With vintage luxury being a hot topic, essentially the reason why I'm making this video, because this is a hot topic right now, I feel, and it's only getting hotter and hotter, and people are only leaning more and more into vintage luxury. So vintage luxury seems like it's a little bit more accessible. It's a little bit more it's easier to obtain vintage luxury items now compared to back in the day. When we talk about vintage shopping, it's like, you know, going to this specific store in this specific area, and usually it's like what, California, New York are like the top two places people kind of associate vintage shopping with a little bit. And you know, it's not the easiest thing to navigate, and you have to like know where to go and who has what, and then like it's like you fingers crossed that you find something that's like what you like and that also fits. And you know, so I feel like there was a lot of like crossing your fingers back in the day when it came to buying and shopping vintage. Now I don't think you do as much fingers crossing, because they've set it up in a manner where there's vintage in places that are like not just designated as vintage stores. Like Farfetch, they have a vintage section on their website. So you literally do not have to scout anymore for vintage items. You can go on eBay, The Real, so many places now they have vintage open to the masses, so it's not as much of a hunt for you to find whatever pieces you want, or just to look at any type of vintage luxury items. And I do feel like this has taken away from the originality of, like, you know, that vintage shopping experience where you do kind of go on the hunt, and you do have to like go to these like shops that are a little smaller, and you just have to be in the know to know these are like the correct spots that have the correct things. And I think now, like also with vintage shops, you know, they would have people go in and like, you know, sell their items. Now people are just going online instead, or going to maybe a shop that has like, you know, a bigger well-known name in order to give their items to, in order for them to be like, you know, resold. So I do feel like it has hurt a little bit of the originality that comes along with the vintage experience and vintage shopping, which in the past could be seen as a pro or a con, kind of regarding like, you know, how to find these pieces, and kind of your standpoint too on if you're okay with kind of going on a manhunt. So from the people I've spoken to who do have vintage luxury items, they normally tell me that the quality is a little bit better compared to what the quality of luxury items are today. So this is coming from the people who I've spoken to. I do not have like, you know, vintage luxury items, so I can't attest to this, but the overall consensus is that the quality is better. So take that as you may. They say that, you know, a lot of these like, you know, bags, the leather, the gold use, everything is better compared to what is being, you know, sold today. So I do think that factors into why vintage is like, you know, up and rising, and people are like, yes, give me vintage, I want vintage. And then there's also the fact that, you know, with these vintage pieces, a lot of brands are coming out with these items again. You know what I mean? They're just coming out with them again. They're reissuing them. Like Prada reissued a lot of stuff. Gucci reissued things. Chanel reissued things. It's like a constant cycle with fashion. And I feel like that's something that has always been around, the constant cycle of something coming out, what, 30 years ago, and then it comes back out again, and they tweak it just a little bit. So I do feel like that component has, you know, definitely helped with vintage items being sold more now, and people just like, you know, saying, hey, I bought that bag 20 years ago. They just came out with a newer version, but let me sell mine and make some money, because people are like going for these. And you know, the newer versions really do not have too much of a difference, you know what I mean? Like, let's take from Dior the saddlebag. The one that originally came out compared to the ones that were reissued, like, guys, Exactly. So I do feel like that's another thing that helps vintage, because the fact that it's like, hey, instead of going to the store to buy brand new, something that, you know, people would always do back in the day, people are like, let me go get it vintage, let me go get it pre-loved. Something that back in the day people would look down on and be like, why would you get something pre-loved? Why would you buy something that's been used? Why not get it new? So I feel like with trends and with the times, different things are going to be in, different things are going to be acceptable, whatever. I feel like in a couple years it's going to be like, no, don't do vintage anymore, only buy brand new again. Like, so it's always like that. So since, like I said, vintage luxury is kind of like a trend piece right now, it's like trendy, it's like a hot topic, and everyone's trying to get their hands on stuff. It's like the price. I think I can't avoid discussing the price, because vintage luxury is now really hot. People have been hiking up the prices when they're reselling these items. When compared to back in the day, vintage items, vintage luxury, everything that was vintage was usually, like, you know, less. Like, the money was less. That was a part of the reason why people went the vintage route, in order to buy something at a lower price but still, like, you know, kind of have the look. So I do feel like that has been hurting the vintage luxury market and vintage market in like, you know, all cases, that prices have been hiked up. So it's not even really like accessible as much to everyone, which buying vintage was price-wise more accessible. But I think now, like, I've seen and heard a lot of things on TikTok of people saying they go into these vintage stores and the prices are literally like more than like what they would like go into a regular store and buy these clothing items for, because prices are being hiked up. And I do feel like it's just, you know, it's a cycle. I feel like it's just a cycle, and it's expected. When something is really popular and more people are into it, of course they're gonna hike up the prices. So a lot of these vintage items are now skyrocketing with their pricing. So it kind of like pushes out the people who the vintage market was originally kind of like created for, made for, you know what I mean? And it kind of introduces a new wave of demographic and customers, which of course I would say the whole realm of vintage shopping was not, and it's not something that's all encompassing and inclusive. I think it's just not a space that can be that way, since, like I said in the beginning, it's like more of a niche thing. But now I feel like it's just changing the niche in a way to a different group that is like broader and wider and kind of brings more people in, but at the same time it's still pushing some people out, you know, if that makes any sense. Do I think vintage luxury is worth it? I need to buy some vintage luxury items in order to give you guys an answer. Do I think the prices that, you know, we see now for vintage items, vintage luxury items, are worth it? Given the feedback I've gotten about the quality, then I'm going to say yes, because due to inflation, the prices for these items, like if they had originally came out this year, I think due to inflation, honestly, with the price hikes, it makes sense. And with the quality being like, you know, top tier for these items from what people are saying, then I feel like it does make sense that, you know, the prices are higher now and they are where they are if you factor in those things. And I know like that might not be fun to hear, because vintage shopping is supposed to be like, you know, like secondhand things, pre-loved things, so the prices shouldn't be as much. But I think with the economy, with inflation, and with the quality that these items have, then maybe the prices are justified and it's not just people trying to make a quick dollar. And of course, fashion is a cycle. One day something's trendy, another day something else is not trendy. So I do think we will get back to that point where, you know, vintage shopping isn't as glamorized. Vintage luxury is not as, you know, used by celebrities, and you don't see them wearing as much. I think we'll get back to that. Like, it's a trend. It's a trend. It's a cycle. things go round and round. So that's my take on vintage luxury, and like, you know, kind of the reasons why it is so popular right now, and kind of like why, you know, it's so different in a sense right now. It's like in a different realm compared to like 3 years ago. So I think all those things are interesting, and it just shows you how fashion is living and breathing, and it's constantly changing, and it's just one of those things that you cannot fit into every single box that is out for fashion at a certain time. You're going to miss some boxes. You're not going to fit in this area or that area. So that's why it's very important to have your own sense of style, your own sense of being and confidence, and just wanting to look good for yourself and feel good for yourself, and, you know, playing up with what works for you. Maybe vintage luxury does not work for you, and that's okay. So I think this is just another example, a way to show you that, you know, fashion is just, it's fashion. It's all in your mind. And, you know, these fashion brands, these luxury brands have gotten into the minds of so many of us, and, you know, there's nothing wrong with that, but still, let's keep our individuality and, you know, our own sense of style and self. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed this video on luxury vintage, and maybe you guys have some vintage items too, and you can leave your feedback down below on how they wear compared to maybe luxury items that you bought brand new. Or maybe you're strongly just brand new, like, you know, luxury items person, or you're like strictly vintage luxury type of person. Let me know down in the comments. Like I said, I'm trying to look more into vintage items, luxury items. Maybe if I find something I like, I will give it a try, and then I'll be able to give you guys my review, like, and feedback on the process, the money, and whether or not, you know, I thought it was worth it. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If this is your first time watching, please make sure to hit the subscribe button and come back for more videos. And also please make sure to hit the like button as well. Bye.